Welcome to the most disturbing human experiments in history, explained using Minecraft. Let's start off with the tamest experiments and move on to the ones that are straight up crimes against humanity. Number 7. Stanford Prison Experiment. Led by Professor Philip Zimbardo, this experiment took place at Stanford University in August 1971. It was a social psychology study in which college students acted as prisoners or guards in a simulated prison environment for 2 weeks. However, the abuse of prisoners escalated so shockingly that Zimbardo stopped the experiment after only 6 days. Before the experiment began, the guards were instructed not to physically harm the prisoners, but they did it later anyway. Humans, am I right? The prisoners were arrested by actual police from their homes and handed over to the guards in a mock prison while being blindfolded. They were then put through crude treatments that were intended to simulate the environment of a real-life prison. As on just the first day, some guards began to harass prisoners, forcing them to do push-ups and waking them in the middle of the night. Over the course of the experiment, some of the guards became harsh and tyrannical, while several prisoners developed depression and disorientation. A few prisoners had gotten so traumatized that they were let go just within the first 4 days. This experiment went on until an outside observer, Christina Maslach, was so outraged at the scene that she urged Zimbardo to end the experiment, less than a week after it had started. The Stanford prison experiment revealed how even healthy people can turn evil when placed in certain situations. I guess that explains why I always enslave villagers in all my survival plays. Number 6. Cincinnati Radiation Experiments. What do you do when you want to find out what large doses of radiation would do to the human body? Well, you could just blast deadly radiation at cancer patients to find out. Maybe it could cure their cancer. Who knows? This is exactly what happened during the Cincinnati radiation experiments from 1960 to 1971. The purpose of these experiments was to study how soldiers exposed to nuclear warfare would react to large amounts of radiation. Dr. Eugene Sayenger, a radiologist from the University of Cincinnati, requested and received funding from the Pentagon for these experiments, and found his victims at Cincinnati General Hospital. The cancer patients were enrolled in this study under the promise that it would treat their cancer, but turns out it's quite the opposite. Over 90 patients were subjected to radiation equivalent to 20,000 X-rays, and many of them experienced symptoms of nausea, vomiting, and weakness. About 1/4 of the victims died within 2 months of the experiment, and 3/4 of them died within a year. Despite the high death rate, these experiments continued for 5 more years until the study became public knowledge. Yup, I can smell a lawsuit coming, which did happen in the end. Number 5. Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service collaborated with Tuskegee University for this study, and recruited 600 African American impoverished sharecroppers from Macon County in Alabama. Of these men, about 2/3 of them had latent syphilis, and the remaining were healthy, which means they will be intentionally infected. This study aimed to observe the effects of the disease when left untreated, which is pretty messed up. The men were promised free medical care to incentivize them to take part in the study, but even so, they were being deceived because they were never made aware of their syphilis diagnosis. Instead, they were told that they suffered from bad blood, which is a local term used to refer to a range of illnesses, and they were only treated with disguised placebos and other ineffective methods. Initially, the men were told that the experiment would only run for 6 months, but it ended up lasting 40 years. After funding for treatment was stopped, the study still continued without informing the men that they would never receive treatment, and none of the infected men were prescribed penicillin, despite that by 1947, the antibiotic was widely accessible and had become the standard treatment for syphilis. At the end of the experiment, 28 victims had died directly from syphilis, and 100 died because of syphilis-related complications. Not only that, 40 of the victims' wives contracted syphilis, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. Number 4. The Aversion Project. During the apartheid era in South Africa, the South African Defence Force viewed homosexuality as subversive. As a result, the Aversion Project, led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, was founded. Dr. Levin claimed that he had a cure for homosexuality, and in 1969, he was granted an opportunity to test out his theory. When the soldiers first enlisted, they were examined by a doctor to determine if they were gay. The gay soldiers were then sent to Ward 22 in a secret military hospital, where they would be subjected to many forms of therapy, all of which were experimental and inhumane. The soldiers would be strapped down into chairs and forced to view gay pornographic pictures, and as they watched the images, they would be shocked electrically over and over. Dr. Levin hypothesized that the subjects would associate their gay thoughts with the pain from the electric shocks. In between therapies, the soldiers were also injected with drugs so their brains would be in a susceptible state. Horrifyingly, the majority of the soldiers were chemically castrated before they were released from Ward 22, and this led to many of them taking their own lives. But the most cursed treatment has yet to be revealed. Dr. Levin began performing gender reassignment surgeries on some of his subjects. He reasoned that by switching their genders, they would become women who are attracted to men, making them straight. What? Sadly, a large number of soldiers died during these surgeries, and those who survived often suffered from health problems for the rest of their lives. Number 3. Kamera. When it comes to silencing your political opponents, poison has always been a popular weapon of choice, as it unalives your opponent without riling up the public. The Soviet Union was a huge fan of this method, and because of that, they established Kamera, a secret research and development facility, with the goal of developing poisons that were tasteless, odorless, and could not be detected in an autopsy. And what better way to evaluate the lethality of the poisons than by testing them on real humans? The prisoners from the gulags were used as subjects to test a wide range of toxins, including ricin, curare, and cyanide. These poisons were administered to the victims along with a meal or drink and disguised as medication. The experiments led to innovations such as a cyanide that could be deployed as a mist, a poison that made the cause of death appear to be a heart attack, and a gas pistol that could shoot liquid poison up to 65 feet away. One politician was killed by a poison sprayed onto his reading lamp, which the heat from the bulb caused it to disperse through the room with no trace. Ultimately, none could top a poison invention named C2. When exposed to this poison, the victims will experience weakness with a calm and silent demeanor, which ends in death within 15 minutes, making the victims look like they died from health issues. Following the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian government has claimed that the lab was abolished, but within the last decade, many enemies of the Kremlin have been found dead in mysterious circumstances, including some apparently by poison. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. Number 2. Project 4.1. You probably heard that the United States detonated many nuclear bombs during the Cold War to test their destructive power, but you might not know that many of them are tested illegally on foreign soil. From 1946 to 1958, the US detonated a total of 67 nuclear and thermonuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. Altogether, this is equivalent to 7,000 Hiroshima bombs, which contaminated the island so much that the locals suffered from acute radiation sickness, with many cases of thyroid abnormalities and cancer emerging. Babies born looked like jellyfish, with beating hearts but no bones. Unfortunately, the atrocities didn't end here. In a classified hearing in 1956, U.S. Atomic Energy Commission Chief Merrill Eisenberg proposed that the evacuated Marshallese be sent back to Rongelap, one of the nuclear bomb test islands, which he called the most contaminated place in the world. He further suggested studying their irradiation, saying, and I quote, "While it is true that these people do not live, I would say, the way Westerners do, civilized people, it is nevertheless also true that they are more like us than the mice." Yeah, right, you're so civilized. You literally just compared human beings with mice. The 3 decades-long human experiments have commenced. The US government knowingly returned the Marshallese back to the fallout island and sent scientists to study them as they grew sicker day by day. According to Marshallese testimonies, the scientists tricked them into drinking and injecting them with radioactive substances, took painful bone marrow samples, and extracted their teeth to analyze their radiation levels. Even after the Marshallese noticed something was wrong, the US still refused their request for re-evacuation. In 1985, they finally left with the help of Greenpeace. To this day, cancer remains a leading cause of death in the Marshall Islands, but the US government still downplays Project 4.1, refusing to acknowledge the damage caused by the experiment. Number 1. Unit 731. Although not as widely known, the gruesome human experiments they performed are way worse than the ones I talked about. Unit 731 was a secret biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army that specialized in brutal human experimentation during World War II. Men, women, and children were dehumanized to as logs and experimented upon. Vivisection, the practice of conducting surgical operations on living beings, was carried out by Unit 731 without anesthesia on thousands of victims. They were infected with diseases such as cholera and the plague, then had their organs harvested for analysis before they died to preserve freshness. Also, some victims had their limbs crushed, while others had their limbs amputated and reattached to another side of the body. Male prisoners were infected with syphilis to observe the growth of the disease, and it's about to get even more messed up. They were then ordered to rape female prisoners at gunpoint. Terrifyingly, female prisoners of childbearing age were forcibly impregnated so that weapon and trauma experiments could be conducted on them. Pregnant victims were infected with many diseases and subjected to chemical weapons, bullet wounds, and grenade injuries. They were later dissected, and the impact on the fetuses was examined. Unit 731 also tested the lethality of swords, bayonets, and knives on their prisoners. Even worse, they tested flamethrowers on both covered and exposed skin. Gas chambers are built to study subjects exposed to blister agents and nerve gas. They've also done frostbite tests by dipping the prisoners' limbs in a tub of ice until their limbs are frozen solid. Prolonged X-ray exposure was conducted, which sterilized and killed thousands of victims. Heavy objects were dropped onto secured subjects to research crash injuries, and there were victims devoid of food and water to study how long humans could survive. The list of experiments go on, and there might be way more of them, because much of the evidence was concealed by them burning the records and murdering all the prisoners when the Japanese lost the war. To this day, the members of Unit 731 still roam free, and have never faced justice for their barbaric crimes, because the US authorities secretly granted them immunity from prosecution in return for access to their research. Now that's the true American way,